Hello everybody, this is Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. We hope you enjoy this essay, and while you're with us, please take a moment to subscribe below. This essay is about what happened to women and gender equality and quotas when communism collapsed in the Soviet Union. Now we need to go a little bit of background to this, but among the reasons for the failure of socialism and communism being a more militant version of socialism, was the multiplicity of unneeded, invented and unproductive jobs created to ensure full employment and to give a false semblance of socialist equality across gender, race and class. Using the communist Soviet Union as an example, the Soviet Union or Soviet Russia started out in 1917 with violent revolution. From 1923 onwards, the Soviet government sought to industrialise the nation very rapidly, which created labour shortages in what was at the time an 80% rural-based agrarian economy. Because of these labour shortages and the need for a literate workforce, women were required as workers. Thus, by necessity, women and girls were given the same education as boys and offered industrial and any other job which was guaranteed via quotas. The Soviet labour shortage lasted from 1923-1924 during the mass industrialisation period, which particularly began with the 5-year plans in 1928, through the war years 1941 to 1945, where more than 8 million Soviet male soldiers died, and into the early 1970s, before the male population recovered and the acute labour shortages lessened somewhat. In a tenet central to socialist economics, every citizen must work and consume, and through this contribution to the greater good, assist in meeting central economic planning objectives. This mass participation model, where everybody works, everybody consumes, which is theoretically efficient, lasted right through to the collapse of the Soviet state in 1991. For feminist and socialist academics, this is seen as a golden age for female educational and employment equality, with almost 50% of workers being female by the late 1930s and 50% of college students being female by the early 1930s. Female literacy among young women increased almost fivefold in less than 10 years from 1923. Any and all jobs and professions were open to women, and to make sure gender equality didn't miss the central plan employment quotas and lowered entrance requirements and reduced standards to college were added to the mix to help things along. Women could pick what work they wanted to do and have that decision supported by the state. As ideology played such a major role in Soviet work and social structuring, merit and objective standards either did not apply or not applied in anything other than a small number of select situations. Space research, pure maths, metallurgy, engineering design and so on did require the objective best available, but other examples of merit-only spaces were quite rare. So 67 years of forced gender equality policy and 73 years of socialist ideology in Soviet Russia. Even today, Western socialist academics go misty-eyed with delight reimagining this so-called nirvana of gender equality. It allows so many of them to look past the paranoid secret police social controls, the arbitrary arrest and the mass murder of the Soviet regime. It is an interesting juxtaposition of ideals, a regime that casually murders tens of millions of its own citizens while purporting to anxiously fret about getting more women to study engineering. Similarly, the Soviets created and made much fanfare over International Women's Day, which has always excited the leftist academics the world over. This so-called honouring of women was more a cover for exporting socialist revolution to the West, which formed an integral part of the Soviet constitution, than it was about any actual concern for women. But was it actually a gender socialist paradise, as the swooning feminist academics at a Western university close to you like to tell us? Well, let's look a little closer and see. And after 3 generations of equality socialism, where 96% of the Soviet population knew nothing else but equality socialism, what happened to women and so-called gender equality when the socialism and the quotas went following the 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union? You'll find this part interesting. Okay, so let's jump in. The Soviet plans for rapid mass industrialisation, which after 1928 were called 5-year plans or the National Economic Plan before that, usually had very ambitious production targets involving substantial expansion of existing city-based factory estates and building industrial towns and cities close to raw materials and or close to major transport interlinks. The pace was frantic and vast amounts of labour were needed, and quickly, to work in the factories. Any and all workers that could be found were put to work. Gender was almost irrelevant, such was the urgency and capability was seen as a bonus if you could get it. Just having someone upright and warm to stand next to the machine was the first priority. Most workers at the time worked on the land in smallish farms. The Soviet government collectivised the farms into gigantic state farms and coercively moved the people, the men first and the women soon after, to the cities and the newly established industrial areas. At the time, only 10% of women and 30% of men were considered functionally literate. Literacy being essential to an industrial economy, the Soviets decreed all children from 7 years of age should attend a minimum of 10 years schooling. Some exceptions were made for particularly remote locations, but boys and girls studied the same subjects in the same classes. If equality of education is what was wanted, this was it. Women were often reluctant participants in the early stages of the industrial economy, and this included the many widows with no young children, following the many male deaths of the First World War and then the Russian Civil War. Accordingly, Soviet propagandists invented the gender struggle paradigm and put about posters and socially educational radio broadcasts telling women they were chained to the kitchen and oppressed by patriarchal males. Go to work in a factory and it'll liberate you. The road to freedom, liberation and ideological social bliss lay in long shifts at the factory machine on that dirt floor, that unheated factory, with all that industrial noise, smoke, grime and dust. No pollution masks and ear hearing protection back then. Not surprisingly, there were few takers amongst women at first, even when the propaganda was ramped up with lurid poster images of women actually in chains, allegedly clamouring to be liberated by their sisters. Ultimately, it was the state coercion that brought women into the workforce in numbers approximating those of men. Moreover, people on rural farms could live off the land, but once forcibly induced to move to the city, they needed to work or could face a prison term. Only when not working was decreed as a social crime involving loss of all state benefits or even imprisonment did women's workforce participation jump dramatically. Even so, women had many exemptions. Some were obvious, such as pregnancy or caring for young children, but also included caring for, say, elderly relatives, very generous sickness benefits and study allowances. As so many women preferred pregnancy and young childcare to working, the Soviet government created perhaps the most comprehensive kindergarten creche childcare system in the world. Putting the issues around poor standard of childcare to one side for a moment, this service was provided not necessarily as a service for women or families, but rather to remove the excuse so many women were using for not working. By 1970, almost 9.5 million kindergarten childcare places existed in the Soviet Union, not including the many smaller community and informal type facilities supervised by parents or small communes. Asking women to make sacrifices for the revolution or to get excited about losing their supposed chains and going to work in difficult jobs wasn't really cutting through. Women weren't really buying it. The government methods thus became more coercive, particularly between 1940 and 1950, where a woman turning up for work late 3 times could go to prison, and the government also menaced the benefits for her elderly relatives, which could be taken away without notice. Similarly, the government ramped up its efforts to get women to study science and engineering subjects. This is a big political topic today in the West. Listeners will be interested to know that getting women into science was a particular focus of communists and socialists since the early 1900s, so it's been around for over 100 years. There's nothing new. However, this was not about enhancing the position of women, as is mistakenly thought, but about reducing the power of men, who were always seen as a bigger threat to authoritarian power. Outside of the direct coercion, the success of the Soviet state in materially changing the behaviour and choices of women was minimal in terms of work and educational choices. Like Western governments today, the communists resorted to quotas, outcome targets, lowered standards and extensive use of redefinitions in pursuit of the gender equality paradise. Incredibly, and almost overnight, 40% of chemistry PhDs were women, or so government announcements claimed in the late 1940s. Yet even here we see not so much soft exam marking that goes on in the West today, although this clearly went on in an effort to create equal gender outcomes, but rather reclassifying and redefining. Women studying, say, a 1-year course in agriculture, the government would redefine this course as engineering or chemistry or science and then claim huge numbers of women, science graduates or even PhDs were passing through university. That almost none of these women ever appeared or became employed in the chemical engineering courses they supposedly passed gives away the extent of the sham. Nor was this statistical chicanery confined exclusively to women. It also had classist overtones. Young men and minorities in Providence could, on a whim, be awarded an engineering degree or an apprenticeship qualification by decree of the Central Soviet Committee after just 1 or 2 years of, say, a 4 or 5 year course. They were just awarded the degree. Whereas sons of better educated and more refined parents who ever had to pass the full course with all rigour and examination or may not even be allowed to go to university as they had privilege. The Soviet Union and also other communist states like China, women were heavily overrepresented in those occupations that we could call social or artificial ideological employment, but nonetheless in policies consistent with everyone works, everyone consumes economic perspective. Around 10% of male employment could be described as invented employment, but this increases to over 40% with women's employment in the Soviet Union. The job titles for entry-level clerical work, mostly chosen or preferred by women, were often flattering. Basic clerical jobs such as typing up and filing the factory's weekly production numbers was referred to as an economist. So Russia had millions of economists. Other title-related anomalies existed for occupations chosen by women. The person working on a checkout at a food store or wheeling out the potato trolley onto the shop floor could be called a sales manager, thus qualifying as a manager-supervisor in the employment statistics. Due to labour shortages generally and to induce full female employment, the Soviet Russian government also created many politicised poster child jobs for women, such as factory foreman in a large and prestigious factory, and this was publicised widely in the Communist Party propaganda newspapers such as TASS. Similarly, the senior filing clerk in a factory, an occupation mostly preferred by women, could be titled assistant factory manager or risk assessment manager. Yet again, this was all about propaganda and statistics and little else. Another Soviet favourite to artificially create not only full employment but statistically equal gender employment levels was to set up tens of thousands of industry associations, euphemistically referred to as volunteer organisations. These associations were mostly a women-only playground, but did allow the government to claim an extra 100,000 senior women managers in the statistics. Similarly, the Soviets intensively used various devices such as reclassifying and redefining certain jobs. So, for example, women cooking pickles in a factory are retitled food engineers, so the government could propaganda announce the number of women engineers had doubled this year. Or male shoe repairers, if there was considered to be a general shortage of engineers, were retitled as fabric engineers. In 1 year alone, the Soviet government announced more than 200,000 women engineers had been created, as if by magic. Medals were awarded, ceremonies were held. Stalin appeared personally to pin medals on remarkably fit and photogenic young women who also later appeared in Soviet propaganda movies. To point out the obvious absurdity of such assertions and the obvious government deceit contained in the propaganda claims could result in being accused of a hate crime against the state and land you in prison as an enemy of the people. Invented employment to achieve full employment and endless sociological quotas placed a huge strain and overhead of cost and efficiency. This would not have been in and of itself enough to gradually destroy the socialist economy, but it was causally pivotal nonetheless. In effect, it means that Soviet places of employment had one person to actually do the job and another person just to fill the quota. To illustrate the point, even the most efficient Soviet enterprises were less than half as efficient as a similar Western commercial business. Overmanning alone represented 25 to 27% of total female employment. Some male overmanning also existed, but more in relation to slower, less efficient and older plant and machinery that was still being used. Communism declared human health as a natural right, similar in category to, say, food and shelter. In this communal spirit, the pay and benefits to lower-level doctors and dentists fell considerably, while high school and college teachers and bureaucrat propagandists received substantially higher pay and, importantly, benefits. The knock-on effect of this was for Soviet government by decree to reclassify nurses as doctors and dental nurses as dentists, thus proclaiming to the world the superiority of socialism as they had more female than male doctors and dentists. It is, of course, banana republic employment economics, but when the state controls the media and all other public devices of information, reality can simply be decreed. In the early 1970s, at its gender equality peak, about 2% of women had achieved actual STEM PhDs. By including various clerical jobs in the STEM PhD stable, figures of 20% female PhDs were touted. In pure maths research, military metallurgy and space research, other than the odd token woman for poster propaganda purposes, all employees were male. Even though 50% of all workers in the Soviet Union were women, the churn or turnover rate was high, so at any one time only 65 to 70% of working-age women were actually employed. Some of this was due to childbirth and first-year childcare, but also women electing to leave work to attend further studies, often of distinctly dubious value, such as studying the decadent wickedness of capitalism, but courses approved by the state nonetheless. At a rate of 5 to 1 with men, women chose soft college courses rather than work. So, in spite of all this governmental coercion, pushy edicts, propaganda exhortations, and free kick college degrees, what occupations did Soviet women choose to take up? Now, while women were close to 50% of all workers from the 1930s through to the 1970s, even to the late 1980s, women still chose nursing as a number one career choice. More than 68% of health industry workers, such as nurses, were women. Frontline nursing was 90% women. Most or nearly all kindergarten and junior school teachers, retail store employees were women, whereas only 7% of construction and heavy manufacturing employees were women, and even here these were primarily clerical jobs. Keep in mind that this was a woman's choice in Soviet Communist Russia, and a choice made while being exhorted and encouraged every day by almost hysterical propaganda to choose traditionally male jobs, but still they didn't. Much to the exasperation of Soviet employment planners desperate to achieve gender equality, and then when that didn't work, coerced gender equal outcomes, women still chose jobs with less hours and less demanding roles. Roles where they would not be pass or fail judged, and people-to-people work rather than machine or numerical work. Similarly, women did not want to work in the newer industrial towns where many of the better engineering jobs would be found, instead preferring the city with more shops, more nightclubs and more young men. Whereas the state would imprison young men at the slightest provocation, a woman was 9 times less likely to be imprisoned for some work-related misdemeanour. So the Soviet communist state fell over between 1990 and 1991, and the era of socialist communist economics, or state-sponsored socialist economics, came to an end. So what happened to all those starry-eyed socialists and all those gender quotas when communism was no more? 70 years of quotas, gender equal outcome propaganda, both men and women in Soviet Russia at the time knew nothing but socialism. Surely women would have kept all those forced artificial equality educational employment gains. Not quite. Women's PhD level jobs disappeared almost completely. Women in national executive politics plummeted to a fraction of their Soviet representation. Young Russian women suddenly became sex objects to an extent that would make any Western redneck youth blush crimson. Today, most Russian women are studying soft courses and are employed as hairdressers, manicurists, retail shop assistants, sales reps selling cosmetics, kindergarten teachers, and participants in the horizontal intimate relations industry. In a small spillover from the communist days, more community dentists, which really means oral hygiene advisors, are women in Russia today, and almost 50% of clerical risk assessors are women, which can be a job that pays quite well. Put simply, Russian women, even in the glory salad days of communism, where they could pick whatever they wanted to do, still preferred to study courses and occupations that women all over the world prefer, and avoided the more demanding and exacting forms of employment that are often preferred and chosen by men. It was 70 years of trying to force square pegs into round holes, with every device, every deception at hand, as we now see failing spectacularly at great cost. As far as the idea that women and men must have equal outcomes, as far as Russian women are concerned, in the end, it's all come to naught. As if the socialism never occurred, as if all the equality quotas never happened. It has all been a terrible waste. Anyone who meets the required uniform meritorious standards should be able to choose whatever occupation they prefer. There should be no barrier to anyone taking up any occupation if they meet the standard. To force the issue comes at high cost to the wider community without delivering any corresponding benefit, but at the same time corrupting the very standards and associated intrinsic value that we all want to have. We're all justifiably outraged when banks get bailed out with taxpayer money. We should be similarly outraged at the cost of mightily misguided social engineering projects such as this, when if history has taught us anything, they achieve nothing. And keep in mind that the politicians who approve and sign off on this gender equality outcome madness in the West are mostly straight white males. You've never been asked to vote on forced gender equal outcomes. Ask them why this is happening, and ask them to declare that they will stop supporting and funding this madness with your taxes. If you don't get a worthwhile answer, vote them out of office. For those wanting to read further on Soviet economics, and particularly when we see so much of the futile and misguided Soviet-style efforts playing out in the Western economies of today, refer to the multiple works of Alec Nove, N-O-V-E, as a start, at least, and then graduate to more subject-detailed material thereafter. If you first need to get a better grounding in social democratic industrial economics to then better appreciate the comparison with communist economics, consider referring to the works of Professor Andrew Gamble, Gamble spelled Gamble. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for watching. Please remember our essays are available in printed book format.